Le coup de projecteur de l'éclaireur, Pascal Clairotte avec vous. J'ai le plaisir de recevoir à nouveau le colonel Douglas Macgregor. En onglet, vous trouverez une transcription en anglais de cette interview. La version française sera publiée dans le cours de la semaine prochaine. Colonel Macgregor, thanks a lot for taking the time to speaking with us. Can we start first by discussing what happened yesterday with the ousting of the Speaker of the House and the potential impact this may have on aid to Ukraine?
Well, I would consider the following for your viewers in France. We've had what I would call perfect continuity in government for the last 30 years, probably longer. And that is because the difference between the so-called Republicans and Democrats is so minuscule as to be meaningless. And what we've discovered over the last 30 years in particular is that the right has largely capitulated to the left. Now, much of that has to do, frankly, with money and the fact that large quantities of money have been invested by people on the left in buying up support for the destructive policies that they represent. It's also a function of a lack of interest on the part of the Americans who vote in what is actually happening on any given day in Washington, particularly as it applies to defense and foreign policy. And I think finally Americans collectively are beginning to discover this truth, that these two parties are too much alike and that they have very little, almost no representation in Washington. Now, the man that engineered the removal of Mr. McCarthy is a man named Gates. He's something of a maverick, and I think he's now finished as a member of the Republican Party for perpetuity. But what he did is that he persuaded all the Democrats who don't like McCarthy anyway to vote with 8 Republicans who have been very, very dissatisfied with everything that McCarthy has done. These 8 Republicans are not creatures of the lobbyists. In other words, they have not sold out. They have refused to take big money from the large corporations and the large interest groups. They have instead worked to survive in Congress through donations from their own districts, from the people that voted for them. So they're independent as far as their thinking goes, and they saw this as an opportunity to get rid of a corrupt, ineffective, left-wing sellout who calls himself a Republican, and that's why we have this term RINO, R-I-N-O, which means Republican in name only. I think it's a very positive thing. You always know that it's positive when the mainstream media says it's terrible, because they want no change. They want things to continue as they have for decades, and that's brought us to the $33.4 trillion debt, massive spending on all sorts of things, not only defense, but healthcare and social welfare programs that we simply can't afford, an unwillingness to reform, reorganize anything, change anything. So this is a small victory, but an important one. And I think we'll get a better speaker, but ultimately this is just one more step on the road to fundamental upheaval, which I think will come in this country when the financial system breaks and the economy tanks. But until then, we'll continue stumbling forward.
What about the impact on Ukrainian aid, on aid to Ukraine, excuse me?
There is a growing feeling on the Hill, not just among Republicans, but also Democrats, that this investment in Ukraine has not paid off. Now, it's paid off here domestically. It's managed to put hundreds of millions of dollars into the pockets of people who are invested in the defense industries. It has paid off in terms of satisfying various interest groups that are committed to perpetual intervention, regime change, and war overseas. But it's about being exhausted. And as far as Ukraine is concerned, which was always a useful tool to the people waging war against Russia, Ukraine is a failure. It's bankrupt. It's even more corrupt now than it was before the war began. Hundreds of thousands of its citizens have been killed. Hundreds of thousands are wounded. My sources tell me that it's up to somewheres around 450,000 plus dead, and maybe as many wounded. We just don't know. We know the hospitals are full. And in recent reports, we're finding out now that Ukrainian soldiers who are wounded and want to be taken to a nearby hospital because there's no real medical support near the battlefield have to effectively bribe ambulance drivers to take them to the hospitals. That tells you the level of corruption and incompetence that characterizes the Ukrainian military effort. So I think people are figuring this out, and I think the handwriting is on the wall, as we say. Ukraine is going to be lost. And the United States, I think, instead of escalating further and risking direct war with Russia, I think this government will try to do what was done in the aftermath of Vietnam. That's essentially walk away, change the subject, talk about a new alleged enemy. The current cause célèbre is China, and forget Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. From your vantage point, what is the magnitude of the West failure in Ukraine? I'll let you pick where to start.
Well, I was going to say, that's a tough question because we could spend a long time on that subject. I don't think we can possibly know at this point just how profound the effects will be. But I'll speculate on some. Obviously, the most serious one that rarely comes up for discussion is that we have transformed Russia from a state that was either neutral towards the West or periodically cooperative into a hostile state. And this is no minor issue. You'll recall that the argument for provoking Russia, dragging it into Ukraine, and then trying to kill all of its troops was that this whole process would weaken Russia. Well, that hasn't worked very well. In addition to Russia's resources and capabilities on the economic side, which I think have largely thrived, although there's some question now about the ruble, depending upon what happens with the price of oil and gas. Nevertheless, Russia's standard of living and economy are pretty strong. They're not weak. And the Russian military establishment, which was actually quite minuscule, was too small for the task that ultimately confronted them after it became clear there would be no negotiations. And that military establishment is now 1 million men and climbing. And we are now going to see a very, very powerful, robust, lethal Russian military establishment, particularly the army and its capabilities in the Air Force, that we did not see before. So I'd say, number one, we've alienated and offended and harmed ourselves by creating this hostile Russian state that never needed to exist. That's no small matter when it comes to long-term trade and economics, because Russia sits astride all the routes between China and Europe that have to pass through Central Asia. And this One Belt, One Road initiative, which the Chinese have been trying to work on, contrary to what people in Washington say, is not really a threat to us in any way. Actually, it's a very smart idea. But we've treated it as something bad instead of capitalizing on what I think could be good for the world. But nevertheless, that's the case. So we've harmed ourselves with Russia. We've convinced the Chinese that they can no longer trust anything we say or do. The Chinese will now invest much more heavily in defensive weapon systems, particularly missiles, theater ballistic missiles, long-range ballistic missiles, obviously intercontinental ballistic missiles. And most of China's investment is in defensive hardware, but this will now, I suppose, grow. As far as Europe is concerned, I think the Germans have learned, if they haven't learned it clearly, they will very shortly, that they are victims of the United States and its allies. And they have been victimized by their own government, which is a globalist cabal of fools who have not only destroyed Germany's prosperity, but they have willingly accepted permanent servitude within the framework of this thing called NATO and the EU. So I think ultimately the Germans will emerge from this and disengage from both NATO and eventually the European Union. Everybody says, well, when is that going to happen? I think it will happen. I can't tell you exactly when, but I think the drift is definitely in that direction. Austria obviously already subscribes to that viewpoint in most of the elite circles now.
Yeah, but it's neutral, so it's a neutral state, which is not the case of Germany. So it's
yeah, but they have always been very opposed to the alliance. And I think now they've discovered that the European Union doesn't work very well for them. You know, the Germans are discovering that they're the scapegoat for everything that everybody in Europe doesn't like. But the problems that exist economically in places like Italy and Spain and Portugal, or for that matter in France, are not a consequence of anything the Germans have done. Just as the problems that we have economically in the United States or financially are not the fault of the Chinese. They are our fault. And I think you have a similar situation in Europe. I don't think the Germans particularly care to be the milk cow when it comes to cash and finance for the rest of Europe any longer. I think Germany will ultimately renew its long-term strategic relationship with Russia. That's something that worked very well for Germany for centuries. World War I and World War II were short exceptions in the great history between the Russian-speaking and German-speaking peoples. So I think you'll see that assert itself. Now, ultimately, I think you'll see a breakdown in NATO along regional lines. I don't think everyone will want to hitch their wagon to promises made by the United States. I think de Gaulle's old warning to everyone in Europe at the time that NATO really was gaining strength and steam is still valid. He said the problem with NATO is very simple. Britain is an island and Americans don't live in Europe. He was right. The British have never been really part of Europe on a routine basis. They've always found it useful to sit on the sidelines, on the margins, to take advantage of whatever they could for their own financial and economic strength and strategic position. But as far as a reliable partner for people on the continent, I mean, it just has never been the case.
Well, they've been, I mean, if I may just Virginie, the Brits have been reliable partners for France in the 60s and the 70s when it comes to military cooperation and armament development. They were, actually, and still are.
Well, that's 20 years or 30 years out of a history of, 500? My point is very simple. If you go back to the various world wars and the events that led up to them, Britain has always positioned itself on whatever side that promised temporary benefit to Britain. Britain was never particularly committed to anyone. In fact, it was always striking to me the Germans within NATO, at any rate, were always bending over backwards to, cultivate goodwill with both the British and the French. I think they've given up on the British, that's for sure. And I don't think they're going to become hostile to France, but I think the Germans will increasingly decide that their future is not within the framework of this American, or I should say Anglo-American dominated alliance.
I believe that a lot of European countries are going this way too. I mean, it's true for Spain, it's true for Italy, more and more. France always been the case, even though we have currently people running the government which are definitely not of this obedience. So from there, how do you envision a possible security architecture that may emerge from all of this chaos? I mean, both in Europe, but also globally.
Well, globally, you're going to end up with regions of the world that tend to coalesce. Oswald Spengler talked about civilizational similarities that would bring people together. I'm sure that some of that is true. I think also you're going to have regions that for, strategic benefit to all of its members will coalesce. For instance, I think you're seeing that begin now in the Near East or the Middle East, depending upon what you want to call it. There's a recognition that war between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, between Sunni Arabs, Shiite Iranians, doesn't make a lot of sense. The one outlier in the group, of course, is Turkey. The Turks are very anti-status quo. The Turks want to be a great power, but they lack the foundation in economic terms. But they still have aspirations to be the leading Sunni power, and that puts them at odds with Iran and with Saudi Arabia. We'll see.
With the support of Qatar, by the way, the Turks, because that's Qatar which is funding their military expansion.
Exactly. So, I mean, that's the outlier in the region, but I think that regionalization is there. You know, when you come, if you look at the United States is on the verge of bankruptcy. Got to remember what happened at the end of World War II. People don't realize it, but we, that is under Franklin Roosevelt, really ran British and their empire into bankruptcy. Churchill mortgaged everything to the war against Germany. And by the way, there were a lot of people that warned him against that, including his own general staff, who kept telling him, you're worried about the Germans. We see a larger long-term threat in the Soviet Union. But he insisted upon it. And by 1946, 47, the debt to GDP ratio in Great Britain was about 240%. And so suddenly this empire, which they always regarded, even at the beginning and throughout much of the Second World War, as well as the First World War, as their principal concern, was suddenly liquidated almost overnight. Well, I think you have a similar set of conditions emerging in the United States. People who say, well, the Fed can just print money. The Federal Reserve, that is. The Federal Reserve can simply go ahead and buy up bonds. Well, good luck with that, because we're at 4.8% on 10-year Treasury bonds. That's probably going to go to 5%. Our debt servicing payment, and our debt servicing payment on an annual basis is almost $1 trillion right now, or roughly the same size as our defense budget, which tells you just how ridiculous our spending on defense has become. All of these things are going to end. I mean, we're living right now at one of these so-called strategic inflection points in human history. The United States cannot go on as it has for the last 40 or 50 years. We cannot police the world. The American people were never interested in it. And that's part of the reason we got involved, because Americans don't give a damn, frankly, what happens beyond their borders. And that allows small minorities, well-financed minorities in Washington, D.C., to make decisions about where we will invest our time, our resources, and our military power without any accountability. But I think the accountability is going to return in the near future, because if there's one thing Americans will not tolerate, it's a dramatic drop in their standard of living. And right now, that's exactly what millions of Americans are seeing. They're seeing their life savings vanish. They're seeing their health costs and costs of health care go way up. And they're asking, why are we spending so much on these other matters when we have so many more serious challenges here at home? And like you know, we have an even larger illegal migration problem into the country, which the left has made easier and worse than at any point in our history. I was talking to someone in the Homeland Security business, if you will, and he told me, I said, you know, I'm told that roughly 2.3 million illegals have come into the United States since Biden took office. And he started laughing. He said, that's ridiculous. I said, why? He said, because it's at least 7.4 million. I said, well, how do you know? He said, well, truthfully, we don't know exact numbers because we only see a portion of the people that are moving into the United States because the borders are wide open. In other words, we're not registering everyone that comes in. So I said, well, if that's true, then what are we looking at in terms of, you know, large scale illegal presence in the country of alien people, most of whom are from Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, with a few from Northeast and Southeast Asia? He said, well, my best guesstimate would be 28 million. 28 million people living inside the United States who are not here, quote unquote, legally. Now, we haven't even discussed criminality because we have been failing for a long time to enforce the laws in our own country. We're not only failing to enforce the laws on our borders, we're not enforcing laws in our largest cities. So criminality is on the rise, and people are not being prosecuted for terrible crimes. And we haven't even started to talk about human trafficking and child trafficking, which have become multi-billion-dollar businesses, and they all run right up out of Central and South America into the United States. Americans are beginning to feel this. They're beginning to sense it. And that's why I say this train that has been chugging down the track for a very long time without interference is shortly going to run out of coal to keep it running. I think it's just going to stop. So I'm one of these people that doesn't think the disaster in Ukraine is going to escalate to the strategic level. I don't think it's going to become the catalyst for a regional war. Part of the reason I think that is because the Russians have exercised such incredible restraint. I mean, the dumbest thing I hear on a routine basis in the West is, well, the Russians are incompetent. The Russians aren't any good. The Ukrainians did pretty well, but now they're just running out of equipment. We need to give them more. Well, that's a lot of nonsense. The Russians have performed very well. And at the outset, they were a small force designed for homeland defense. And they had to suddenly transform into something that to protect Russia from a serious external military threat coming out of Ukraine. They've done that. So they're not incompetent. But I also think that Putin understands both his people as well as Europe. And I think he knows his people do not want a regional war under any circumstances. They want this war to end. But he's moved very deliberately and very cautiously. The Russians have taken very few casualties in contrast to the Ukrainians. And he's exercised patience, waiting for things in Ukraine, and I would say increasingly in Europe, to fall apart. And I think we're going to see that, particularly as the winter approaches. But, to go back to Germany just for a second, imagine here's the Chancellor of Germany who admits, apparently in private, that he was aware that the United States was planning on blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline.
He even approved it.
Yeah, supposedly. I mean, I don't know. I'm getting this, and I cannot conceive of anything like that happening at any point in German history. I'm trying to think of someone who more profoundly betrayed Germany than this man Scholz. So,
by the exception of
but towards the end, I mean, he certainly did. He just decided that everyone would go down into ruin. But, that was a different set of circumstances. There's no reason to even contemplate such madness. And the Germans certainly don't want to. But at some point, the Germans are going to say that this is outrageous. I think lots of them are already saying it. Now, I heard somebody say to me, well, don't you think you'll have a split in Germany between the North and the Northeast and the South? I don't think so. I think
the East already started.
Yeah, well, I don't think it'll happen, but people are seeing it that way because the people that live in the former territory of the German Democratic Republic are far more nationalistic than the Germans living in the West.
They're Prussians.
Well, maybe not. Most of them are Saxons. But, at the end of the day, this is not going to work for Germany. It's not going to stand. And I think we'll see upheaval there. But the Germans are not French. I think the French would be in the streets and there would be blood flowing by now.
No, it may come. The thing hasn't got, it's pretty tense down here right now. To be quite frank, it is awfully tense.
Yeah, but if the Germans were French and not German, I think Scholz would be gone. My impression in France is if they play the Marseillaise and you don't stand up and sing it, people will come over and beat the crap out of you.
Nope. No, it's not. That's not that well.
Well, I saw that when I was in France and in Wallonia, in French-speaking Belgium. I saw real French nationalism when people didn't get up for the national anthem. I was privately delighted to see that the French felt that way. But the Germans are coming back. I think the Germans are tired of apologizing for a past in which they had no part. Mm-hmm. They're tired of apologizing for things that their great-grandparents did, frankly, and they want to get on with life. But they're no longer, like their relatives who once saw the United States in a very positive role. I think they now see the United States as a catalyst for conflict.
That's the case of more or less all European countries. I mean, from Finland to Malta. I'm speaking about the population. I'm not speaking about the leadership.
Yeah, but what you're saying is why the leadership will change. You've just pointed it out. I mean, across Europe, we're going to see turnover in governments. You're not going to get everything immediately. I think you'll go through several turnovers until you finally end up with anybody who's any good. We're going to go through something similar here. The interesting part is that if you look at the polling data in terms of people's attitudes towards the war in Ukraine and Europe, and then look at the attitudes here in the United States, they're surprisingly similar. Just a few months ago, Americans were saying, well, we don't want to get in this war, but we think we should support the Ukrainians. Now people have said more than 56% are now saying, stop, halt all aid. 62% of the Polish electorate is saying they're not going to pay any more for any Ukrainians inside Poland. And they think aid to Ukraine should be dramatically scaled back and eventually stopped. A year ago, that was impossible. Emotions were running very hot in that country. Now they aren't. You know what's happened in Slovakia. The Slovaks are following the Hungarian pattern. I have plenty of friends and contacts in the Czech Republic, and they want nothing to do with this war against Russia. And I think you're right to some extent about the Finnish population. What I don't know is how people in Denmark and Sweden are feeling. But at some point, to get back to your original question, new security architectures, you've got a split in Europe, a split between Central East, Northern Europe versus Southern Europe. Yeah, it was always there. And this whole thing was artificially constrained by the American presence and influence. So in many respects, Europe and its interests are coming back into play in ways that haven't been true for almost 100 years.
How do you see in this context, how do you see the U.S. Presidential campaigns going about?
I think we have collectively, with very, very few exceptions, extraordinarily disappointing people running for office. Trump is well known to people, and Trump is somebody people like for many reasons. But even the people that really like him question the wisdom of putting him back into the White House. The truth is that he was there for 4 years, and he wasn't able to accomplish the goals that he set. And I think that was in part because he didn't know how the place worked. He didn't understand the nature of our bureaucracy and its opposition to any change. I don't think he understood the entrenched interests in the military, the intelligence communities, and all of the departments of government. And so, frankly, we lost 4 years. And that's tragic, but we really did. I think Americans are looking for someone new. Now, you have RFK Jr., this is Robert Kennedy. He says many good things, and people like him. And I think he's going to run as an independent because he's figured out that the elections inside the Democratic Party are rigged against him. Of course, I don't know why anybody is not pointing out that it's not only the elections inside the Democratic Party, but on the national level that are rigged. Again, you've got large numbers of Americans who are coming around to understanding that election integrity is a joke. It's never been what it ought to be in this country. And just to make sure your listeners understand something, we are operating with a governmental structure that was devised in the 1780s. We haven't had a first, second, third, fourth, fifth republic. We've had this one structure. That structure was designed in the 1780s for essentially an English-speaking population of 80+%, with some number of Germans, a few Swedes, and Frenchmen. And the biggest concern that people had at that point was to come up with a constitution that would make it explicitly clear what the federal government could not do. So if you read our Constitution, it's all about what the government cannot do. It doesn't talk about the government doing anything. because at the time people didn't want the government in their lives. And one of the amendments or pieces of law inside the Constitution that's very, very, very important that we live with now is that the responsibility for conducting elections has been left at the state level. You have 50 states. There is no uniformity. Every state runs it to their own satisfaction. And you have people locally elected or appointed that run these things. And depending upon the circumstances, they may be good or they may not be. The point is that if we were a modern nation state, frankly, I think you would have standards across the board. You would have to come in and prove, first of all, that you are a citizen of the country. Secondly, you'd have to prove that you are a valid resident of that particular area where you're voting. Those things would have to be proven. And you would have people there representing the federal and as well as state levels to oversee this and ensure that this paper ballot that was being handed to the person would be appropriately filled out based on the validation of those 2 points that I just made. Well, we don't have anything like that. In fact, the left wants us to abandon any form of identification. And in some cases, your ID doesn't matter very much. And we have a lot of fraudulent IDs. In New York State alone, there was an assertion, it's not proven, but I've heard it, that perhaps as many as 600 to 8,000 illegals in New York voted in the last presidential election. And I grew up in Philadelphia, Philadelphia City in the United States, and we haven't had a clean election since 1960. I was witness to it many, many times, beginning in 1960 with President Kennedy's election.
Well, the purchase of votes, yeah.
Yeah, my point is that we're in a very strange position in the United States because we've gotten about as much out of this old structure as we can get. And I think we're at the turning point. What do we do for the future? How do we govern this country effectively? We're very large, and we haven't looked at it. I once sat with a general, a 3-star general in the Chinese People's Liberation Army in 2001. And he spoke to me at some length about the feeling in Beijing that China was too big to be governed from Beijing, that they were going to have to form regions and largely autonomous governments to handle a whole range of issues because centralizing everything was not only unwieldy and impractical, it actually promoted corruption. They haven't managed to fix very much. We haven't even started to try. So what I'm trying to do is get people to understand that much of what we have been doing is a function of the position that we occupied in the aftermath of World War II, for which we were completely unprepared. We thought World War I was a terrible mistake. Virtually all of the veterans came back and said, what did we fight this thing for? You've got to remember that in 1914, when the war began, 1/3 of our population was German. People had very high opinions of Germans. My grandfather, and I have no German family or connections at all, but he came back from France, and his view was we fought the wrong people. The Germans and Austrians weren't our enemies. We had no role in this. Why were we there? So as a result, it was very difficult for FDR to drag us into Second World War. And he worked very, very hard to precipitate this bombing of Pearl Harbor, this attack by the Japanese. That gave him license to drag us into the Second World War. Again, my point is, historically, Americans want nothing to do with overseas wars. Nothing.
Yeah, John Quincy Adams, seek no monsters abroad.
Yes. And it's still true now. If you look at the polling data, Americans did not like what we were doing in the Middle East. Yes, they like to watch victories on TV. They like to watch campaigns that are short, sharp, and decisive. But they don't like occupations of other people's territory. We're not imperialists. And when we try to be imperialists, we're very bad imperialists. So all of this comes into play. So I think the United States is going to turn inward. And we've got a lot of problems to solve. And we've got to face up to them. And it's not going to be easy, but it has to happen. Meanwhile, the question is, what are Europeans going to do? And I think you have already hit the nail on the head, as we say. You have already described the truth, and that is the populations in Europe are not very happy with many of the decisions made by their current governments. Scholz is probably the worst example. My impression,
Macron is not bad either. Meloni is going down too.
yeah. So if that's true, I think you're going to go through something similar. The real issue is, and I've said this for a long time, if the Europeans want this war in Ukraine to end, they've got to stand up and end it, because the people in Washington will just shovel money and pretend that something good is happening. Remember, they can lie about whatever they want, and the average American who's not terribly interested will shake his head and walk away. I mean, what difference does it make to us who governs the Donbass in eastern Ukraine? What difference does it make to us who was elected in Alsace-Lorraine or Normandy or Provence? Do you understand? It's not our business, and we don't care, but we have a small minority of well-financed people in Washington who are very interested in everybody else's business. And we have been meddling in everybody else's affairs for years, but we're running out of money. We're running out of resources, and the American people want answers to questions about what's happening at home. All they have to do is look south to the border, and they are now openly asking, where's our army? Where is it? What's it doing? Why isn't it on our southern border?
Thank you so much for your time, Colonel Macgregor.